Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. In this video, we're going to be looking at this painted mid-century modern style piece. And right off the bat, you could see there's quite a bit of damage on the top. The corners are pretty alligatored and there's these really weird black spots that I really honestly have no idea what they are. But you can see they're pretty much all over the top. There is a little bit of alligatoring, not a lot, but a little bit by the corners, as you can see right here, as well as a little bit on the edge banding. Now this whole piece has pretty much been painted top to bottom, and you can see there's 3 different coats of paint on the drawers, one in a white, a baby blue, and a black. I just did a little test scrape there just to see how many layers of paint I was dealing with, and also what type of wood was underneath on the drawer faces. Normally you can tell what kind of wood you're working with just by looking at the top, because the rest of the piece is most likely going to be the same wood, or at least the same species. Now, I got this piece off of Facebook Marketplace for, it was, I believe, $85. And the original owner, actually, when she found out I restored furniture, she was so happy because she actually really cherished this piece and she kind of regretted painting it. Now, this piece is made by Dixie, and just a little funny story about Dixie. Dixie was actually the first piece that I ever worked on in my refinishing career, so it's a little nostalgic for me. Now, all of these drawers were actually in very good condition. It was only this top drawer right here that needed some work. Now, in typical MCM fashion, these pulls are basically just built right into the drawer face. There's like a little recess that's built in up into the drawer face, and you just put your hand right in there and you can pull it right out. So this piece is definitely going to take a little bit of work. It's definitely going to take a lot of work to get all of this paint off. But if it turns out anything like I'm envisioning in my head right now, I think it's going to be beautiful. So, well, you know, we'll see what happens. But anyway, let's get into it. So one thing that I actually didn't mention in the beginning was that this piece actually had a pretty strong odor. It smelled pretty musty and mildewy, but it also had a very strong odor of a certain type of herb, if you know what I mean. So I'm using some diluted cleaning vinegar. And vinegar is really good for getting rid of odors because the acetic acid that's in vinegar actually bonds with odor molecules and neutralizes them, rather than just masking the odor. So I'm using distilled white vinegar to basically clean every single surface of this piece. I'm cleaning the carcass, of course. I'm cleaning the drawer boxes. I'm cleaning inside of the carcass especially. And I'm most likely going to be replacing that back panel because the back panel is where a lot of odor likes to hide. And you may be thinking, why clean the piece if you're just going to be stripping the paint off? And that's because there was a very thick odor coming off this piece from wherever it was stored previously. So the more you can get off now is really the better. And plus, you know me, I'm very OCD when it comes to cleaning. So I got a new carbide scraper, and I've seen a lot of other people using this carbide scraper, and it looked like it does a really good job, so I wanted to try it out. And this also has like a little knob or a handle on top of it, which makes it a lot easier to use. It gives it a lot more stability and control, which I think is just fantastic. And it felt a little bit weird at first because I just had to get used to it, but eventually it really did just a fantastic job. Now, there is a difference between the metal scraper that I was using in my past videos and this carbide scraper. The carbide scraper uses a tungsten carbide blade, which is significantly harder and more durable than a traditional metal blade scraper, and it tends to hold its sharpness a lot longer than a traditional metal scraper. And I just love when paint just scrapes off like this. It's just so satisfying to me. And here's a little bit of a tricky area. I have to get the paint out of this little lip over here. And to do that, I'm going against the grain a little bit with the scraper, which is not something you ever really want to do. But unfortunately, I didn't really have a choice, so I'm just doing it extremely gently. And luckily, I got it off without gouging the wood. And it's the same thing over here. I'm trying to get the paint off of the little edges, and I'm scraping the edge of this edge banding. And if you do that, you just want to make sure that you're doing it extremely gently because it's very easy to gouge the wood. And here I'm going to be using this little teardrop shaped scraper. And these things are absolutely fantastic for using on trim that is curved or decorative. And if you do buy one of these on Amazon, just make sure that you buy the kit because the kit will come with a variety of different shapes of heads that you can use. And it makes scraping all of these concave and convex trim work very easy. So definitely check that out. Now this trim work that I'm scraping off here, this is not walnut. This is actually a different type of wood. I believe it might be poplar. I'm not 100% sure. But it's not the same wood as walnut. So if I were to put a clear coat on this along with the walnut, it would be a very obvious difference in color because walnut tends to be kind of reddish brown. It varies a lot actually with walnut, but typically walnut tends to be kind of reddish brown. But this trim that I'm scraping off is going to be probably a very light color. So I'm going to have to stain it to match. Now these detail scrapers are also really great because they can get right up against the edges and you can get pretty much all of the paint off. And I started to scrape this little corner right here and realized that this piece of wood was actually split down the middle. So I'm going to have to glue and clamp that up, but I'm going to do that a little bit later on. For now, I'm really just trying to concentrate on getting this paint off. And I switched between scrapers. All the flat surfaces, I just used my regular carbide scraper. And for all of the curved trim work, I just used my detail scraper. And now for scraping the sides. You could see as I scrape the paint off, there's another layer underneath that's a little darker. And that's actually the original finish, which is probably a layer of shellac or lacquer. So I have to go through both layers. I have to go through the paint and then I have to go through the original finish and prepare the wood as much as I can for sanding. And you can see I'm wearing my respirator, which you don't really have to wear a respirator when you're scraping. But me personally, I like to wear it just because there's a lot of fine dust that gets thrown up into the air when you scrape. And it's better to be safe than sorry. But you definitely can just use a plain like N95 mask or just a regular mask. And that original finish was actually more on the thicker side, so it took a little bit of muscle to get through. But with this new carbide scraper, it actually made it a lot easier. There's something so satisfying to me about vacuuming up all the scraps on the floor. I don't know what it is, it's just so satisfying. And now I'm just going to flip him on his back just so I can get at the feet and the bottom trim. And first I'm going to just give it a really good vacuuming to get rid of all the cobwebs and dust that's accumulated over the years. And then I'm going to come in with that same cleaning vinegar and just give it a really good cleaning. And you can see like in little quick glimpses how dirty the bottom actually was on the towel. It was pretty dirty. And after that's all clean, I'm just going to unscrew these bolts that hold the legs on and carefully remove the legs. Now these legs, just like the trim, are not solid walnut. It's a different type of wood. So I'm definitely going to have to stain and tone them later on. And I'm just going to label them really quickly just so I don't mix them up and forget how they go. And I'm just going to continue taking off the rest of the legs. Alright, now it's time to scrape down the rest of the piece. Now I don't have to get all of the paint off, it's not imperative that I get every single last drop of paint out. All I'm trying to do right here is just get enough off to make a sanding job easier. And this little piece that I'm scraping right here is actually walnut veneer. It's not the same wood as the legs or the trim. So I don't have to stain the left part that I'm scraping off right now, but I do have to scrape the piece that's on the right. I hope that made sense. And I forgot to do this little corner edge on the top on the other side, so I'm just going to do that really quickly. And again, you really don't want to scrape across the grain like I'm doing here. But unfortunately, I really didn't have any other way of getting that paint out, so I'm just doing it extremely carefully. And luckily, I didn't really disturb the wood fibers too much. It's the same thing over here. I'm scraping the bottom edge, and I'm also doing this extremely carefully because it's obviously very easy to gouge the wood doing this. I'm literally just letting the weight of the carbide scraper do the work. I'm not putting any pressure downwards. All right, I'm just going to flip it back upright, and I'm going to start working on the top. Now, as I said in the beginning, this piece had some alligatoring on the corners and a little bit on the edge banding, and it had a bunch of these weird black spots that were all over the piece. It's definitely not black mold. I could see why some people would think that, but it was very hard and almost like tar. I'm not really sure what would have caused that, but it was all over the place. And luckily it came off pretty easily with the carbide scraper. Now here, I just wanted to show you that this edge banding is actually flush with the top. So if I were to just do one long stroke with the carbide scraper, I would basically rip the edge banding right off. So what I like to do is I like to scrape all the way down to about like an inch before the edge, and then I'll come in on about like a 45-degree angle, and I'll just very gently. It looks like I'm doing it pretty hard here, but that's because this piece is actually sitting on dollies right now, so any pressure I put on this piece, it's going to start rocking. But as gently as I can, I'm going to, on a 45-degree angle, just scrape the rest off that edge. And it's the same thing on the other side. I'm just going to come in on that 45-degree angle. And if you're not sure about the edge banding and can't tell if it's flush with the top or if it's below the top, it's definitely better to be on the safe side and just try that method instead of accidentally ripping the edge banding off. Alright, so I scraped off pretty much this entire piece, and now I'm going to come in with a 180 grit piece of sandpaper on my surf prep and start sanding. And I'm starting with a 180 grit because I got pretty much all of the finish off. There's only like a very little bit of finish remaining, and 180 grit is more than enough to cut through the remaining finish. Anything more than that would just be overkill, and I would just dig in way too much into this veneer. And all of this footage right now is in real-time speed. I wanted to show some real-time speed footage just to give you a better idea of how slow you actually need to go when sanding. Sometimes people go a little bit too fast, and that usually is the reason why you get some of those pigtail marks, which are a pain to get out. Also, pressing down too hard on the sander can also get those pigtail marks. You really don't need to put that much pressure on the sander when you're sanding. You probably should let the weight of the sander kind of do all the work. Alright, so the whole top is sanded down, and I'm noticing a couple of stains that I want to get rid of. And to do that, I'm going to use some oxalic acid. Oxalic acid is basically a wood bleach, and it comes in a powder crystal kind of a form, and you just mix them into some hot to warm water, and then you apply. I'm using a chip brush to apply it, but you can also use a rag or a foam brush, whatever you prefer. And you might be asking, why are you putting it on the entire top if you're just trying to get rid of the stains? And the answer is, since this is a wood bleach, if you put the oxalic acid only on the stains themselves, that's the only part that's going to lighten, and you're probably going to get some very strange results. So just put it on the whole area that your stain is on to mitigate the risk of getting some bleach spots. And with oxalic acid, you want to apply it and then let it completely dry. So while that is drying on top, I'm just going to work on the rest of the piece, starting with the sides and then the edge banding and the trim work. Now right now I'm sanding with a 180 grit, but I'm going to go up to a 220 grit as my final grit. Now for the trim work, I'm just going to be using a 180 grit, and that's the only grit I'm going to be using on the trim work. And this is because basically the lower you sand, the more darker a stain is going to appear. So I want my stain to be on the dark side, so I'm going to be sanding to 180 grit. But if I wanted my stain on the lighter side, I would probably sand to like 320, somewhere around there. Now I'm using my surf prep to sand all the flat parts of the trim, but as you saw before, I was using a little rubber contour sanding block, and those things are really great for sanding all of those kind of curved and weird shaped trim. And I just realized doing the voiceover to this video that I totally forgot to show the process of me testing this paint for lead, but it came back negative. There was no lead in this paint, but it is something that I would like to include in my next video, which is going to be coming out pretty soon. So sorry about that, but I'll definitely show you the lead testing kit and everything in the next video. So now my oxalic acid is completely dry and it's time to neutralize it. So what I'm doing is I'm mixing about 2 tablespoons of baking soda into about 8 ounces of water. And I'm going to submerge a shop towel in it and just very liberally wipe it on. Now what the baking soda is going to do is basically raise the pH level of the acid and neutralize it. And if you look really closely, you can actually see what looks like smoke coming off of it. And that's actually carbon dioxide, which is just a byproduct of the neutralization, which is pretty cool actually. Now you're going to want to wipe this down with the baking soda solution until basically there's no reaction happening. That usually tends to be about 2 times with the baking soda solution. And then after the baking soda solution, you're going to want to wipe it down. I usually wipe it down about 3 times with water just to get rid of any residue that's left behind. And it's very important to not let any of the liquid kind of sit on the veneer, if you're working with veneer, that is. So you want to basically kind of get it on and then get it off. And what I mean by that is after you put any liquid on the surface of the veneer, take a dry paper towel and just wipe it off. Alright, now to tackle these drawers. There was actually 3 layers of paint on these drawers rather than the 1 layer of paint that was on the carcass of the piece. So I used my carbide scraper to scrape almost the entire front face of the drawer, and then I just came in with some chemical stripper, clean strip premium stripper, and I just stripped off the rest. Now I'm working with paint stripper, so this stuff is extremely harsh. The fumes are horrible. So I'm wearing a respirator, gloves, and I even sometimes wear safety goggles just to protect myself against this stuff. Now all I'm doing here is I'm just letting the stripper sit on the drawer faces for about 5 minutes because it's a pretty fast acting stripper, and I just wait for it to bubble up. And once it bubbles up, it's ready to remove. And I'm just using a putty knife just to remove the bulk of the paint. I absolutely love when paint strips off this easily. It's also so satisfying. And for all of the trim work around the drawer face, I'm just using a stiff nylon brush, and that did a pretty good job of removing most of the paint. And you'll notice here I'm wearing a different type of glove than normal. These are actually called butyl gloves, and they're specifically made for handling certain chemicals like acetone and stripper. Normally I would wear 3 pairs of nitrile gloves, but nitrile gloves are not really made for chemicals like that. They kind of disintegrate after a while. And I'm just really trying to practice safer methods while handling these certain chemicals. So what's happening here is I'm just using some acetone just to clean up all the residue of the paint and get it ready for sanding. And here I'm just using that pointed end of my detailed scraper just to pick out the little pieces of paint that I couldn't get with the nylon brush. And I'm just showing you a couple shots of me picking out this paint, but I did this for probably 2 hours. It took a while, but the more paint I can get out before sanding, the easier a sanding job is going to be. So I'm just trying my best here and trying to get as much of the finish and paint off as I can. And now it's time to sand down the drawers. And it's the same thing with the carcass of the piece. I'm just using a 180 grit just to smooth out the surface and just to get whatever remaining paint is left in there. And as you can see, I'm just using my Surf Prep sander just to sand all the flat areas, and then I'm going to come in with some hand sanding and sand all the trim work. And again, I'm using that contour sanding block just to make sanding this trim work a lot easier. Alright, now to fix that little broken piece of trim work. This repair is actually pretty simple. I'm just pulling down on that piece of wood just to open up that crack a little bit. I'm going to put some glue and then wipe away the excess and clamp it up. Now for the drawer boxes. I'm just going to be sanding the entire drawer box inside and out, and I believe I'm using a 150 grit on the drawer boxes. Now this is something that you don't really have to do, but I love doing this just because it refreshes the drawer box and makes it look nice and new again. When I refinish something, I like to really refinish it inside and out, top to bottom. Now this is a great shot because you can see that little routed recess that's underneath the drawer face, and that's actually the little handle or pull for the drawer, which I think is just so cool. And you can see the difference in this sped up shot right here of the difference that sanding the drawer box makes. It just really refreshes it and makes it look nice and new. And there were a couple random holes that were in the top of this piece, so I just filled it up with some walnut wood filler, making sure that I left it proud so that when I sanded later it would be flush. And now I'm just going to work on these legs, and I'm just using my carbide scraper just to get most of this paint off. I don't have to get it all. Like I said before, I'm just trying to get as much of the paint off as I can just to make sanding a little bit easier. And once I got most of the paint off, I'm just going to come in with a 180 grit and give these legs a really good sanding. And I like to sand the edges also, just to round them off a little bit, just so they don't end up splitting down the road. Okay, now it's time for my final sanding of 220 grit. And I'm just using the pencil trick here again, and I know if you've watched all of my videos so far, you're very familiar with the pencil trick. But for anybody who's unfamiliar, all the pencil trick is when you make light marks with a pencil over the surface of the wood, so that when you sand, you know where you haven't sanded, and it can prevent you from sanding too far into the veneer. It's really a very helpful trick, especially if you're working with veneer. So other than that, I really don't have much to say right now, so I'm just gonna let you enjoy this very satisfying sanding. There were a couple specks of paint that I just could not get out with sanding, so I'm just coming in with that same teardrop shaped scraper, and I'm just going to pick those out. Now I'm only showing you a couple of shots, but this process again took probably another hour to completely get all the paint out. It was a lot of paint picking. And I'm just doing my final touches of sanding, just getting the inside of the carcass and getting ready for stain and finish. I'm also giving the runners a little hit with the sander just to clean them up a little bit. Oh, and one thing I totally forgot to do was to fix this little piece of trim that was missing some wood. And to fix that, I'm just going to use some quick wood epoxy, which is a really good epoxy. It actually dries harder than wood, so it's very strong. And all you do is you just break off the amount that you need it in between your fingers, and then you just form whatever shape you're trying to make. And you want to kind of feather it on to really give it the best chance of adhering correctly to the wood. And after you've feathered it on, you just want to start shaping it. And you don't have to make it perfect, because you remember you're going to be sanding this down later on, so you could really sand it down to shape. You just want to get the basic shape of what you're trying to go for. And after letting it dry for about 3 hours, I came in with a 150 grit sandpaper and just sanded it down smooth and shaped the edge. Now it's time for the finish, and I'm just using a tack cloth here just to make sure I get all the dust and any other debris that's on this piece off. And I'm going to start here by applying some Easy Vinyl Sealer, which is a sealer for wood by Mohawk, and it's going to also act as a primer for the lacquer that I'm going to put on later. And I'm choosing to put lacquer on this piece rather than like Odor's oil or something like that, because there was a lot of imperfections on this piece, and normally I would actually embrace those imperfections, but in this case they're just imperfections that I'd rather not see, so I'm just going to be putting on some toner and lacquer as my finish. And I'm going to be doing 2 coats of the Easy Vinyl Sealer, lightly sanding in between each coat. Now for the toner. I don't use toner really that often. I only use toner when I really feel like I need to. Normally I would use something like Odor's oil just to bring out the natural beauty of the wood. But in my opinion, that beauty was kind of lacking a little bit. On top of all the imperfections, the color of this particular walnut just wasn't really catching my eye. So I figured that using some toner might enhance it a little bit. And you can see right here, the can of toner actually spit on me. So I'm just trying to feather that in a little bit with a brush. But the reason why I'm talking about toner and me not really using it that often is because I made a little bit of a mistake here. When you're using toner, you really want to kind of be far away. You want to kind of mist it onto the piece. You kind of want to, like, I don't know what a good word is, like fog. You want to kind of make a misty fog of the toner and let it settle down onto the wood. You really don't want to be close, otherwise you're going to get blotching, which is exactly what happened to me. So I let the toner just completely dry, and I came back in with a little bit of lacquer thinner. And if you never use lacquer thinner on lacquer, it works basically immediately. It just completely strips it off. And yeah, I just had to strip off all the toner that I used. But it's all right, you know, you live and you learn. I'm not an expert. I do this for the love of it. And I'm learning every single day. Every new piece that I take on, I learn something new. And mistakes are just a part of that. You know, sometimes you learn the most from making mistakes. Even if it's something that you knew you shouldn't have done, which in this case is exactly what happened. I knew I wasn't supposed to be that close to the piece when spraying toner, but now I'll definitely remember for the future. So all I'm doing here is I stripped off all of the toner, and I'm just giving the entire piece a really good scuff sand, and I'm going to start reapplying the Easy Vinyl Sealer 2 coats, and I'm going to try to respray on the toner. Now this is sped up, but you can see the difference here. I'm much farther away with the toner, and you can see that color slowly start to build up. And you can see what I mean about like kind of misting it on. You kind of want to let the mist just kind of fall down onto the wood. And once I got the color that I was looking for, I just gave the entire piece a really good scuff sand, and I scuff sanded in between each coat of everything. So in between the Easy Vinyl Sealer, in between the toner, in between each layer of the lacquer that I put on. And I'm not sanding aggressively, I'm just giving it a very light sanding. And now I'm going to start putting on my lacquer. And I'm using clear satin pre-catalyzed lacquer by Mohawk. And I did 6 layers of lacquer on the top and 4 layers on everything else. And one thing I totally forgot to do was to fix this drawer. The top drawer was basically separated from the dovetails, so I just put a little dab of glue in between each dovetail and wiped up the residue and then clamped it up. And now for the stain, and I'm just making an Odor's oil stain, but this time I'm actually making a more transparent stain. Now you guys have seen when I've made these stains before that the stains usually look very opaque and almost like a paint. But in this case, I'm actually making the stain a little, well, not a little bit, much lighter and more like an actual stain. And I'm just mixing in my pigments, and I just used 2 pigments. I believe it was Brick and Buffalo Brown. And with those 2, I think I'm going to get a pretty good color match to the toner. And all I did here was I just mixed in my pigments into the Odor's Safer Solvent. And once I found the color I was looking for, I just put in a little bit of Odor's Super Duper Everlasting Oil, and I started applying. Now, because this is a very light wood, I'm using the stain first, and then I'm going to go over it with a little bit of toner to hopefully get a pretty good color match to the rest of the walnut on the piece. And just like any other stain, I'm just going to apply it, let it sit for a couple minutes, and I'm going to wipe it off. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good base color for the toner that I'm going to put on a little bit later. I think that's going to make a pretty good color match. And I'm also applying it to the trim. I'm also going to apply it to the sides of the drawer face just to get that light wood looking a little bit closer to the dark walnut. And I let that stain dry for about 3 days, actually. I usually, when I used Odor's oil stain, I usually let it dry for about 3 days before applying my top coat. And that's just because I don't want any resisting when I put on my top coat. I want it to adhere correctly, and I want to make sure that the stain is completely dry. I'm just putting some hemp oil in these drawer boxes just to freshen them up a little bit. And don't worry, when you put hemp oil in drawer boxes, all you do is you apply the hemp oil, you let it sit for a little bit, and then you wipe all the excess away. So there's no worry about it getting onto your clothes. I also wanted to freshen up the back panel a little bit. I was actually thinking about replacing this back panel, but I realized that there really wasn't that much smell coming from it. So I just left it on. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of a refresh, making sure to leave all the information that's on the back intact. Alright, it's time to screw the legs back on, and we're almost done here. So I realized that most of the smell was actually coming from inside the carcass itself. So all I did was I just vacuumed out all of the sanding dust that got in there from me sanding. And then I just took some more distilled white vinegar and I just cleaned as much of the inside again as I could, because I already cleaned it the first time in the beginning. But I decided to clean it one more time just to be absolutely sure that I cleaned every square inch inside of this piece. And you can see here just how much dirt and filth accumulated just from that couple of days that I worked on it. So I'm making sure that I really clean this really good. And what I'm going to be doing next is applying some shellac. And shellac is great for odor blocking. So basically whatever odors that remain after I do this last cleaning with the vinegar, I'm going to seal everything up with some shellac. And that should definitely get the job done when it comes to the odor. And I sprayed literally every square inch inside of this piece. And that's pretty much it. We made it to the end. I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for watching another video. I'm sorry it took so long for me to get it out this time. Feel free to leave a comment. I always love reading your guys' comments. Like, share, and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Everything helps. I'm still a new channel, so it's all very much appreciated. So let's take one more look at what this piece used to look like. And it was painted top to bottom. Luckily, it wasn't painted inside and out. There were scratches. There were these weird black things that I still don't know what they are. There was alligatoring, and it just was overall a very dingy kind of looking piece. I really hope I did this piece justice. I had a vision for it in my mind, and it definitely lived up to it. I love it. I think it looks pretty nice. And I know the color isn't going to be for everybody. It is a pretty reddish brown, but I like it. I don't know. I think that color suits it pretty nicely. And you're going to notice in the reveal, the lighting is a little bit strange. I know that. I'm still working on getting some good lighting downstairs. But anyway, keeping that in mind, enjoy the reveal, and I will see you next time.